Fanita, what are scripts in transactional analysis?
Byrne developed the idea that around the age of 4, 5, 6, a child develops a script or a concept of how he or she is going to develop his life. He or she develops this concept on the basis of whatever experiences he's been having by that age. They include fairy tales, TV shows, dialogues overheard amongst his parents or his peers, whatever else he was living with. And he or she decides, that's in quotation marks, how he's going to live his life in the future, what his life will look like, what kind of a person he wants to be. Byrne was influenced by the fact that he saw very many unhappy people in his practice, and was also influenced by Claude Steiner, and they developed the idea that scripts are negative, that it's unfortunate if a 5 or 6 year old child develops, if my 5 or 6 year old child developed the blueprint for my future life, and that very many people were bound by an unhappy script due to whatever experiences they were having at this age. I was never happy with that concept. It seemed to me that children are capable of developing happy scripts too. And that while I agreed with Byrne that a certain blueprint is set at that early age, I also believed and believe that it gets modified and adopted at various stages of life.
But you came up with the concept of the epis-script, I think.
Yes, that was much, much later, while I was still struggling with the extent to which I accepted Byrne's definition of script and rejected it. And at a certain point, I had the experience that some clients sounded as though they were feeling bound in a certain way, compelled to act in a certain way, compelled in their inner being, not compelled with outside force. And they took on, and certain people whom not everybody took on, became what I called vulnerable recipients of scripts that were dumped into them, so to speak, by a powerful other. The powerful other was often the parent, the real-life parent, or sometimes later in adolescence by a teacher or even a therapist, unfortunately, or at any rate somebody who had some psychological power over that person. And then that person felt compelled to act out a kind of script that was not really their genuine script, but corresponded to the wishes of that other powerful donor. And usually these were negative and harmful scripts. So that an epis-script is really harmful. The question of whether you can ever have a good epis-script often came up in my workshops. And occasionally I had to concede that it's possible. But basically I think of an epis-script as a negative, as taking on an obligation in life. And my best example for that would be the young people who were influenced by Osama bin Laden, who took power over their psyche, so that they felt compelled to do a destructive thing against America, even at the cost of their lives. Think of it, these were intelligent young men. They were able to take on much education, learn to fly and to act. I mean, they were not dummies who were forced to behave in a certain way. And yet, for them, the meaning of life was to attack America at all costs, and even if it was suicidal. And we see such examples, unfortunately, rather often in psychotherapy, where a person feels compelled to enact a certain play, a certain way of being, which is not theirs, which corresponds to something that was passed on by somebody else. It can even be somebody who's, it can have been taken on even at a later stage of life than early childhood.
Could you give us an example of how a parent could put an episcript onto a child?
Yes, the original case where I first thought of an episcript was a young helper I had where I was teaching a course, and he was training to be a therapist with another therapist. And he was very intelligent and very helpful and very knowledgeable of theory. And he was running a therapy group which was supervised by somebody else, and which he liked to chat about once in a while. And he once told me about a client in his group who he thought, his terminology was destined for the crazy house. And I was struck by this expression because he usually used very erudite terms, and referring to psychosis or whatever, to a psychological breakdown or to a psychiatric asylum, as a crazy house was like a child. He talked about it with his child, and yet he was functioning as a therapist. And at a certain point he came and told me with great satisfaction, I saw the child. You know, I told you about this client. I thought she was destined for the crazy house. And sure enough, she had a breakdown and she had to be sent to the psychotic, to the hospital, to the insane hospital. And I wondered about the satisfaction with which he said that. You'd think that as a therapist, he'd be feeling very bad about this. And I asked him, where did you first hear the expression of crazy house? And he said, oh, my mother was often saying to my brother and myself, you kids will never drive me to the crazy house. Or sometimes she'd complain, you kids want to drive me to the crazy house, but I won't get to the crazy house, and so on. And I wondered whether he had ever felt that he was destined for the crazy house. And he said yes, he often felt that he might have to end up in psychiatric treatment, in heavy psychiatric treatment. And that stunned me. And then there were a few other examples in my practice where I was stunned and thought that this sounded like the definition of script that Byrne gave, but these were exceptional cases. These were not regular cases. And I felt it was important to distinguish between a script, which can be very positive, of this is how I'm going to be, and then gets modified over the years, and an episcript, which is almost a dictate, an inner dictate of how I've got to end up. I've got to end up as a suicide, or I've got to end up deserted, or I've got to end up lonely, or I've got to end up friendless, or whatever. I've got to end up whatever, the ending of the epis-script. And I wrote that up, there's a long story, I wrote that up in a very short article, very, very short, 2-page article, which is available in the literature. And Byrne liked it. It was towards the end of his life, though we didn't know it, and he was writing his new book, which was his new book. I've forgotten the name of it now. And he liked it. He published it in the little bulletin which he was publishing at the time, and he renamed the idea of epis-script as, no, I'm sorry, I'm saying it wrong. I called it the anti-script, and he renamed it epis-script. And then later he renamed it over-script. He played around with this concept. And there is a reference to that in the last book he published, which was published actually after his death. And since then, many people have found the concept very useful. A transmission, the definition of an epis-script, is a transmission of a script, which does not belong to the person himself or herself, but belongs to the other person who's transmitting it and getting rid of it, so to speak. It almost sounds like a magical process. And in fact, with therapy, it's possible to help a client get rid of it in an almost magical way, because it was taken on by a gullible child.
How can the person be aware of this so that he can deal with it?
Actually, very easily in therapy, in the course of transactions with a therapist, who may see that kind of compulsion to end up this way or to proceed this way, and confronts the person and deals with a child who takes it on, and develop certain phony magical rituals to get rid of it.
Fanita, you said that you become a therapist, and that exactly fulfills your life purpose. I think words to that effect. And it seems to me that you have always been a very intuitive person, in touch with other people's feelings. How did this start? Where did this begin? When can you, looking back on your life, when can you pinpoint that you were destined to be a therapist?
I didn't quite think this way. I now know that the central aspect of my script was to be a gypsy. You see, you've got to think in terms of childhood approaches, childhood language. My son's idea was that he was going to be a garbage man. Mm-hmm. He became a lawyer, collected people's garbage and dealt with it. Around the early ages, I was always told by my father, it's always influenced, the script is influenced by messages from people around you and by the circumstances. And I was always impressed by my father's telling me that I am not to grow up like a standard Romanian wife who is a burden to her husband. Mm-hmm. Comes in with a dowry and is a burden to her husband. Suppose I should be able to develop my own abilities and earn my own living. It affected my script. I did feel that I should find a way to earn my living, but I couldn't think of how. And the image I had in Turkey, where I was growing up, was of the gypsies, who were colorful and free. It's a child's image, not what we know about those poor gypsies who were being persecuted, but rather the women who were carefree, walking around the streets in colorful clothing and were willing to tell you your fortune if you crossed their palm with silver. And I thought that that's a great life to live. And eventually, my career blossomed into someone who was traveling and doing a lot of workshops. This evolved very slowly. The interest in psychology and the interest in becoming a therapist evolved as I was growing up. The way anybody's interest in developing some kind of a career evolves. So there's two different aspects of it. To be able to live out the life of gypsy became satisfactory much later in life.
Yeah. Okay, Fanita, thank you so much.
You're welcome.